begin with some meditation again. Just relax your body, relax your mind. Relaxing your mind, yet focusing it on the breathing, also involves a certain sense of renunciation, knowing already from your previous practice that all the problems, the things that our mind might be compulsively drawn to thinking about, are insubstantial, they're impermanent, they're the nature of suffering and so forth. So you can let them go, and just with the intention of concentrating the mind to meditate, just focus on the breathing. And recall that since beginningless time, I've been under the influence of my attachment, anger, ignorance, all of the 84,000 delusions, have experienced every joy, every suffering within cyclic existence, still not satisfied with the happiness, not discouraged by the suffering. even when I happen to experience a life of leisure, rarely, or life in the upper realms, that's not real happiness, just a relief from suffering, but the very experience of it is of the nature of suffering. Try to recall that. Take it as an example, sitting in the sun when you're cool, imagining that experience is real pleasure, the contact with the sun rays, real pleasure, the source of real pleasure, the feeling that we experience real pleasure. Whereas we can understand that even at that moment, it's merely a diminishing of the discomfort of being cool, while the discomfort, the suffering of being hot is still less intense than that. We call it pleasurable. When the bigger suffering is going down and the lesser suffering is still to reach that level. Same thing with everything. All the samsaric experiences, contaminated happiness that we experience. Sweet words, being noticed, our desire to be loved, having wealth, have power and autonomy. From a worldly sense, all of these merely remove the frustration or the desire, the irritation, the thirst for these because we have attachment, and we experience them momentarily as relief, and we call that pleasure, whereas coming in contact with those contaminated phenomena eventually turns into obvious suffering if we were to have to hear the sweet words again and again, or constantly be in contact with the attractive person. There is nothing within cyclic existence which is a true source of happiness. So thinking, I must escape from cyclic existence. I must find a way, even in this lifetime, to find the real path to true happiness, which doesn't depend on the transitory events, inner peace of mind, Dharma happiness. And it's not enough that I find that for myself alone. All living beings, having been my mother, my dearest friends in numberless lives, even when enemy, they've helped us. To feel some warmth for them, compassion for them. Understanding the self that we would be trying to seek liberation for, in our own case, alone, doesn't actually exist the way that our mind conceives of it. That we could begin to conceive of the sense of identity, our self-identity, with all living beings, all sentient beings. That whoever experiences happiness because of our deeds brings us satisfaction. So with that thought in mind, I'm going to study this afternoon, participate in the second part of the practice day on Tenets, the Buddhist philosophical schools, to better understand the gradation of Lord Buddha's teachings so that I can put them into practice, transform my mind, find real peace of mind myself, so that I don't harm others and actually eventually become in a position to help them ultimately. So with that long aim in mind, I'm going to participate in order to become enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings. And then bring your attention back. Present. So, we talked a little bit this morning about the sort of overview of the four tenets again, and a little bit about how one might meditate on the Four Noble Truths from the point of view of the lesser school, lesser vehicle. In particular, one would meditate, it's understood certainly in the tradition, that the real essential element of those meditations is meditating on the aspect of selfless in the first noble truth. It's that wisdom that we develop that overcomes that ignorance with regard to the Four Noble Truths that acts as the antidote to the cause of suffering, to the klesha, right? As we understand. So remember, there are two kinds of selflessness that are talked about in the Hinayana tradition. Do you remember, Carrie? Gross selflessness was mentioned this morning. And subtle selflessness? Yeah, that's right. That's not enough. No. What is the gross selflessness of persons from that perspective, lower school perspective?
I feel the mind ray on me. I think the gross selflessness was the aggregates are inherently don't exist. What we perceive of as the person is not inherently existent. And the subtle
from the Hinayana point of view?
Yeah.
The Hinayana point of view said everything inherently exists. Everything conventionally truly exists. So that can't be right. Can it? Okay. Those rays of the camera have evaporated Carrie's mind. I'm sure we'll find an antidote sometime. Maybe tapioca pudding. Study. That's what it is. Don, do you remember? Oh wait, Diana said it. She wasn't called on. She was bemoaning at lunch.
The gross selflessness is being empty of being permanent, partless, and independent.
So that.
And the subtle is empty of being self-supporting, substantially existent.
Right. So, from where's this idea of a permanent, partless, independent person come up? Supposedly, it doesn't arise innately in our minds. It's not something that cows and ants and any being who's born has innately a sense that I am permanent, partless, and independent. It's something that arises because of tenets. And that particular view is the view that was held by some of the Vedic schools, that the soul, the Atma, was permanent, partless, and independent. So although that is a selflessness of persons, realizing that's only what we call intellectually acquired. So that the wisdom that counteracts that is not going to be able to propel you to the path of seeing, because it's on the path of seeing, even according to Hinayana school, where you overcome the innate wisdom, not just innate ignorance, not just the intellectually formed grasping at the self. Does that make sense? Think about it for a second. What do you think? What's your doubt?
No, I think I was just confused confused. I thought that at the path of seeing you overcame the intellectually formed.
You overcome them due to the force of the antidote, but the wisdom, you're not meditating on the antidote to the intellectually formed. You actually are meditating. That's a good point. You're meditating on the appearance to the consciousness of the innate form of the self that appears innately, even to when we're born as animals, when we're children, before we've studied any kind of tenets. And in meditating on that and realizing it directly for this first time, the force of that is so strong that all, not just this particular intellectual misconception, but all the intellectually formed grasping at the self is annihilated. You don't annihilate that intellectually formed grasping at the self by meditating on just the emptiness of a permanent, partless, independent person. That's not something that will lead to a real cessation, right? True cessation takes place when you achieve the path of seeing, right?
But you don't overcome the innate grasping until the path of meditation, right?
Right? But you have the antidote. You have the antidote to it. Actually, on the path of seeing, when you're in meditative equipoise, there is no grasping at that point. There's no grasping manifest. But to actually have cessation, you have to cease from the root the grasping and its seeds. The Tibetans call sabon. So there's kind of two different levels of seeds. Something we call seeds that give rise to the delusions, and then something more subtle we call imprints. So on the path of seeing, you eliminate, by meditating on the wisdom that realizes the emptiness of the self supporting substantially existent person. That's what you're actually meditating on there. You're not meditating on the emptiness of a permanent, partless, and independent person. But that, by the way, along with all the rest of the intellectually formed delusions, that is eliminated from the point of view of the lower school. Let's say from the Madhyamika point of view, Prasangika point of view, let's say. If you meditate on the path of seeing, are you meditating on the emptiness, the lack of a self-supporting, substantially existent person, which for them is what? Gross or subtle selflessness of persons? That's a gross. Are you meditating on that, on the path of seeing? Is that your main object of?
No, it's the emptiness of phenomenon.
Well, it's emptiness of self and phenomena, emptiness of a truly existent self, let's say. And by the way, that intellectually formed grasping is ceased. You're not taking it as your main object of contemplation at that time, that you're not trying to develop at that point a wisdom that merely sees the lack of a self-supporting, substantially existent person, which is, for the Prasangika, an intellectually formed. Actually, there is also an innate form of grasping a self-supporting, substantially existent person, which is eliminated. But the intellectually formed grasping at truly existent person and a self-supporting, substantially existent person are eliminated. Then you can't eliminate from the root grasping to a self-supporting, substantially existent person. From Prasangika point of view, I think, merely by meditating on some meditative experience on that, it's going to be something that in future lives will come back, because in order to have a real cessation, true cessation, you have to meditate on emptiness, not just a lack of a self-supporting, substantially existent person. Does that make some sense? You following, Venerable? Carrie, what do you think? No, nothing at all. It's going in 1 year, going. Pardon? Sorry, what was it?
It's just going over.
It's going over. So who understood? Can you explain, Mark? Can you explain to Carrie what I just said? No, not Carol. This gentleman in front of her. Carol, not Carol. Mark. Difference.
I could.
Well, then let her try. Not yet.
Okay. Frank, can you explain?
If you're looking for what you're meditating on, or what's the difference between gross and self? I forgot the kind of
Well,
context.
kind of the context was
Carol.
Diana, goddess of wisdom. Isn't that what it is in Diana in Greek mythology? I think she's the wisdom. God.
I thought she was just a goddess of wisdom.
Not Dionysus. Yeah, she's just the goddess of wisdom in this class. Okay. She had said she was surprised when I said the object that you meditate on, the emptiness of, is not the intellectually formed grasping. That's not the main object that you're meditating to develop a wisdom on. You're not trying to find the antidote of that only on the path of seeing. You're meditating principally on the antidote to the intellectually formed delusions. And she brought up the fact that on the path of seeing, it said that the intellectually formed delusions are ceased. None of the innate klesha, or say the innate grasping, has a true cessation on the path of seeing. It's only subsequently on the path of meditation, again meditating on emptiness, that you start to eliminate the innate grasping a true existence, right? So she thought it sounded somehow different than she was thinking, to say that you're meditating on the emptiness of the subtle object of negation. But without meditating on that, you're not going to have a true cessation. You're only going to have, you can during this lifetime, and the arhats do, according to the Prasangika point of view, meditating on this grosser sense of a self, not the subtlest sense that the self is appearing, the innate way that the self is appearing, and the innate way that the mind is grasping at it, but on a slightly grosser level, how the self appears as self-supporting, substantially existent, and how the mind grasps to that. You can meditate particularly as on an antidote to that, as is done in the, let's say in the Hinayana, or is thought to be done in the Hinayana tradition, especially meditating on impermanence and so forth. But that itself won't even cease that, so that we'll never come back again. In subsequent lives, you can still develop that kind of both intellectually formed and innate version of the gross self, grasping to a self of persons. Is something echoing in your mind now? You starting here? So, if the tenets, from the Prasangika point of view, if the tenets hold, the lower school tenets hold that is the subtle selflessness of persons, and they only provide an antidote, and a practitioner were only to have that ammunition, that weapon, the antidote to that, it wouldn't even be able to provide a person to achieve, you couldn't achieve the path of seeing so that you had a true cessation of even the intellectually formed version of that. So the main object you take all the time on the path of seeing from the point of view of Prasangika, path of seeing, path of meditation, is always the emptiness, the subtle emptiness of persons and phenomena. The only difference between the two is the object that you're taking as your object of observation, whether it be a person or a phenomena. Remember there was some questions in the examination. Has everyone handed in their examination? No one's going to hand it in after class. Right? Okay. So, it might be clever you to get some last information. From the lower point of view, let's say from the Chittamatra point of view or the Svatantrika point of view, the emptiness of persons and objects is radically different, because there, what you're negating is different. When you talk about the emptiness of the person, you're talking about the lack of a person being self-supporting, substantially existent. When you talk about, let's say from Svatantrika point of view, when you talk about the emptiness of phenomena, you're talking about phenomena being empty of being what? Truly existent. The Svatantrikas say truly existent, but from a Prasangika point of view, that wouldn't even be real true existence. because they still assume some kind of inherent existence, a basis, an inherently existent basis that can be found somewhere. So when we meditate on the selflessness of persons, the gross selflessness of persons, it's not a futile effort. You might say, well, why bother? You can't have true cessation. Well, why bother meditating on impermanence? You need to strengthen the mind to start to eliminate some of the gross grasping in order to be able to see clearly the subtler levels. So it's not at all useless and can act as a temporal antidote. But my understanding is that merely meditating on the lack of a self-supporting, substantially existent person won't be able to cause a true cessation of that, because you can't achieve the path of seeing that way. So if I say it that way, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So although you're meditating on the emptiness of that subtle object and trying to overcome the grasping to it, that subtle grasping to it, by so doing, that subtle grasping in the meditative equipoise will be gone. In meditative equipoise, if it's actual path of seeing, there's no manifest grasping to true existence at that point, because you're perceiving emptiness directly. But you haven't caused the innate grasping to undergo a true cessation. That only takes place not only when it's not manifest, but when you've eliminated the seeds to it. And that meditation on the path of seeing is not sufficiently powerful yet to eliminate the seeds of the innate grasping. The innate grasping to true existence is unmanifest at that time. Making sense? One year ago, would you have been able to understand what we were talking about now? So it's like. So Carol's probably there saying, I don't understand. Yeah, 1 year ago. Right, okay. So we've made some progress. At least we can understand what this kind of level of investigation. Venerable, do you follow, or are you completely lost?
The only thing I was going to ask is, if you're saying we can't get to the path of seeing without just by merely meditating on the emptiness of a self-supporting, substantially existent person, is that correct?
From the point of view of the Prasangika, from what we would say is the correct view, right?
But from the point of view of the lower schools, obviously do the Prasangika say they do get there, or that do they also meditate? The lower schools also meditate somewhere else to get
So
there.
there were many, and according to the lower schools that held those tenets, there were many people who attained arhatship meditating on that. Prasangika would say either those individuals, having a vast hearing of the teachings, understood that it was that selflessness of persons was applicable. They could understand from the Buddhist teachings, even in the Hinayana canon, certain citations that the Buddha taught that implied that all phenomena are empty of true existence. And on the basis of that, strengthening the mind and understanding selflessness of persons in that gross sense, some people may have actually understood and maybe received teachings on emptiness and realized that. But otherwise, they wouldn't have attained arhatship unless they realized the subtle object of negation, the emptiness of true existence. So Chandrakirti says in the Majjhimakavatara that even the hearers and solitary realizers realize emptiness of phenomena. Some of the Sakya Lamas and other hearers and solitary realizers necessarily, and if they achieve arhatship, or if they become Aryas, they necessarily realize the emptiness of phenomena. There's no way that you could become a real Arya and cease the delusions without realizing emptiness. It wouldn't be sufficient, as we're saying right now, to merely understand and to realize the gross selflessness of persons from the Prasangika point of view. So those individuals who are practice in tenet systems that only overtly or obviously, manifestly teach that, they either realize it through their own study or through some special oral traditions, or maybe the Buddhas appeared to them, or in subsequent lifetimes. Even though they might appear to others to be arhats, because that lifetime, all of their delusions, manifest delusions, are subdued. There's no obvious kleshas manifesting. Still, they have not eliminated the seeds to those, and in subsequent lifetimes they could arise. So those individuals in subsequent, if not in that lifetime, in subsequent lifetimes would have to realize emptiness to actually eliminate that. That's why it's said that there's this, in the Hinayana schools, it's said that it's possible for an arhat to fall from arhatship. Remember? Someone could be an arhat, and then because of meeting some pretty girl, maybe Carol walks into the room and goes, wow! And then the delusion rises, and then you've fallen from arhatship. The Prasangika would say, come on, guys, give me a break. If you have a true cessation, you're not going to fall from that true cessation. It's not possible that arhats could fall from that. So implication is that some people in early days in the Hinayana practice that did meditate on the gross selflessness of persons, let's say, didn't actually realize it, didn't realize the selflessness, the emptiness of phenomena, and so they really didn't have a direct realization of emptiness. They really didn't have true cessation. And so whatever kind of realization they did have, they could fall from. It wasn't real arhatship. It was kind of something that might, right, even today there could be people that look incredibly holy. Even in our own lifetime, there may be periods of time when we're inspired because of our gurus. You go to the Dalai Lama's teachings, you practice, you do Vajrasattva retreat or something, I don't know what you do, and completely, I'm so strong. I'm never going to get angry again. All of those, you can see sort of in your mind all of the futility of this. And then something happens, someone calls you a jerk, or your baby leaves you, or, the tax return comes or something and you didn't get what you expect, and then it's all gone, Someone doesn't give you the piece of cream cheesecake at breakfast, or dinner, sometimes at breakfast. So, but still, that's not to say meditating on the gross selflessness of persons is useless, because one, from the Hinayana point of view, one could attain something that looks like arhatship. I mean, you're completely pacified. There's a lot of debate in some of the other Tibetan schools, I think the Sakya Kargyu Nyingma, saying that Lama Tsongkhapa's interpretation of Chandrakirti is that arhats, Hinayana arhats, necessarily realize emptiness. They don't like that very much. They say that it's possible to achieve liberation merely meditating on the selflessness of the person, or they might say the emptiness of the person, but they mean the gross selflessness of the person. Because basically, when we talk about, we could use the word emptiness to say the emptiness of the self-supporting, substantially existent person. We could call that emptiness. That's not what's usually meant. Or we could talk about the emptiness of a truly existent person, right? The appearance to the mind, how it's appearing to your mind, not just some rambling intellectual doctrine, but how it appears to the mind is slightly different. One is grosser, self-supporting, appearance of a self-supporting, substantially existent person. There's something more subtle and pernicious that's the basis for that, which is the sense of a truly existent person. So unless you've realized that object of negation, that subtle one, there's no way that you can achieve the path of seeing, no way that you could become eventually an arhat. Well, and so some of the non-Gelugpa schools in Tibet might say, well, you don't have to necessarily apply that to phenomena. Well, that may be the hearers and solitary realizers may not meditate extensively that all phenomena are empty of true existence, but they have to realize that subtlemost object of negation, in which case they are capable of realizing the emptiness of all phenomena, because all you have to do then is to apply that same logic to other phenomena. Does that make some sense? Done.
The technique, meditative technique, or tool they might use, like the four we discussed this morning, the object of negation and two, the same or different and so forth, the 4-point meditation. Would they use a similar technique, and might that not lead you to the same thing regardless? What'd you call it?
The Hinayana schools, as exemplified in the Theravada today, if you talk about their tenets, what's come down through history, there's not the same kind of reasoning. One mainly meditates, and remember when we talked about from the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika points of view, one meditated on the aggregates and realized them directly as being impermanent, because you couldn't realize something like selflessness, which is directly with the primary mind according to the Hinayana tenets, right? And indirectly, you'd realize that those aggregates are empty of being a self-supporting, substantially existent person or a permanent, partless, and independent person through other kinds of analysis. But you would have to be realizing something upon the aggregates like that, according to them. So from a Prasangika point of view, that itself is far off the mark, because you don't take the aggregates. When you're talking about the selflessness of person, you don't take the basis of designation of the person as the referent object, what you're observing. You take the appearance of the conventionally existent person. That's what you're referring to. And you investigate how the mind is conceiving of it, how it's appearing, the conventionally existent person is appearing, and how the mind conceives of that appearance. So the conventionally existent person is appearing. The merely imputed person, which does exist conventionally, is appearing to be what? Truly existent, inherently existent. It's how it appears to the mind in a subtle way, and the mind goes along with it. It believes that, at least a sense. Sometimes it grasps. That's what we call grasping, but it could be at least it goes along with it. It doesn't contradict that. There's no wisdom that says that's wrong, the way that that's appearing. So what we have to try to do is to develop that wisdom. So this particular topic, as you study more about Madhyamaka, you can see, once you have a basis in Lama Tsongkhapa's presentation of the path as we study in the Lan Rim and so forth, then you might be interested to study how the Sakya and the Khargyu and Nyingma, they have slightly different viewpoint, but then you can kind of see the incredible value of Lama Tsongkhapa's presentation. Very, very subtle, very, very clear. You have a question, Ren? Okay, I thought you had. Yeah, Frank.
I'm not quite sure how to ask this, but am I correct in assuming that from like the Vaibhashika point of view, it's because external phenomenon are truly existent, that they believe there's a true external basis for the labeling of external phenomena that we label, but not a true basis for our labeling of ourself. Is that a correct statement?
Well, if we go back to the Hinayana school, when we talk about phenomena being labeled, they mean it differently than in the sense of Prasangika. When the Prasangika talks about phenomena being merely labeled, they mean it in a way that even the Svatantrika, Madhyamaka, it's completely, like Carrie went before, it completely goes over their head. Phenomena are, remember you're using this expression. From a Hinayana point of view, there are two kinds of, well, in general, there are two kinds of phenomena, we could say. Substantially existent and imputationally existent. So from the Hinayana point of view, a flower is substantially existent. Let's say a rose. It's not a rose, is it? Is anything here a rose?
Yeah.
Is this a rose?
That one's a rose.
Okay. You can tell. So there he has good conventional. He's on his way to becoming an omniscient Buddha because he knows at least a rose. I don't know a rose from a tulip. Yeah. So a rose is substantially existent, but a rose garden is imputedly existent.
Right.
A tree is substantially existent, but a forest is imputationally or designatedly existent. Why? Because you can't perceive the concept of forest without perceiving the collection of parts. Other examples that are given are an army as opposed to a soldier. Just seeing a soldier or 2 or 3 soldiers, you can't say you saw the army. You might in some cases, but you didn't actually see the whole army. Or a rosary. You know, a rosary, just seeing on the table one or 2 beads or the string, you can't say that you saw the rosary. You have to see the collection of parts. So those things are imputedly existent. And the understanding then is that the self is not substantially existent. The self is something that is imputed upon the basis of the 5 aggregates. So it's imputedly existent that way. But that's different. The level of subtlety, when the Prasangika says the person is merely imputed on the 5 aggregates, there's many, many levels of subtlety. That's why, you know, when one might wonder, I've studied all these different tenets, because the level of subtlety becomes more and more. You start to be able to differentiate between the Prasangika view and the slower view. Otherwise, you might think, oh, the Hinayana schools also talk about the self as being imputedly existent. So what's the big deal? Prasangika, why bother?
Well, the thing I'm trying to get to is, you know, if we both drive to a certain building in Oklahoma and walk in and see a certain cup on the table there, okay, we'll both come back and describe it the same way. Now, I'm thinking that from the lower school point of view, like the Vaibhashikas, they might say that you know, it has an external basis on which we are both, you know, deriving our view of the cup. Mm-hmm. Now, you know, an army is imputational, so you and I might describe the army differently. I might say it's a vast army, and you might say it's a puny army, right? But when you're looking at something that has an external basis like that, they would say that there's a reason why we both see the cup as the same.
No, because someone, you might have said it was a beautiful mug, and I might have said it was a lousy cup. It's still, there's nothing inherent there.
The same marking on the side, right?
Whether it's also the army, which is imputedly existent, you would still say, did it have the right banner? Were there 14 lines of soldiers and 9 or whatever? You know, that would be that's not the difference. The Hinayana, from the Hinayana point of view, based on the Buddha's teachings for them, the first turning of the wheel, is that other than the self. And there are other things, not just the self is imputedly existent. Other things, concepts like forest or rosary or garden or army, so forth, are imputedly existent, whereas other things are substantially existent. Then, from a Prasangika, once you're familiar with a Madhyamaka, you might say, well, it's exactly the same thing. This is also, like a rose garden, this is comprised of parts. But they accept that the rose and different outer phenomena what is actually the rose is the shape of the rose, the visual shape. Usually, I think in flowers is a shape. If you talk about perfume, it wouldn't be the color of the perfume, which was the perfume, but the odor, the fragrance of the perfume, which is a substantially existent external phenomena. Also, the lower schools and the Prasangika both accept that there are externally existent phenomena, an externally existent basis, but there's a big difference in how they conceive of that basis, whether it's inherently existent or whether it's non-inherently existent. Right?
Let me answer my question a little different.
I'll just add one more thing, that being that the Chittamatra would say that there is not an externally existent basis. That it's what appears to be an externally existent basis is the nature of the mind. Okay, and what you were going to say?
So the question is kind of like if I open a book to page 500, and I read the lines in it, and you open the book to page 500 and you read the lines in it, we see the same lines. Now, if this book is a...
what does it say on page 500?
I'm not sure.
Okay, so,
I don't have the same book.
Okay. It says many fallacies.
Well, that's accurate.
Just teasing.
So from the Prasangika point of view, all these external phenomenon are derived from my mind. So if
Wait. From the Prasangika point of view,
all these external objects are not truly existent,
they're not truly existent.
and therefore they're imputed by my mind.
They're imputed by my mind, yeah. But that
So-
doesn't mean that they don't exist externally.
They do exist conventionally. What I want to understand
I'm
is
talking about-
what is the explanation for why they exist conventionally in a way that you and I can see the exact same words on that page?
Because
I'm
we
imputing
have-
it from my mind, and you're
Yeah.
imputing it from your mind, and our minds are different.
Yeah.
So why don't we see different words then?
Because we do see things differently according to our individual karma. We see things the same according to our collective karma.
So I understand collective karma, but does it mean that we each have the collective karma for every single object in every state of the union in every building that we might go and visit?
For the most part, to a certain extent, but still within that there are variations. You might see a beautiful mug, I might see ugly cup. You see someone as, voluptuous and beautiful. I might think of them as just, my sister, just nice, but nothing special.
Interpretation is different.
Well, that's some people. Well, what do we say in the West? We say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? It doesn't exist in the object itself. So that kind of conventional wisdom is talking about that. So there are certain things that we agree on. Let's say, for instance, someone with the collective karma of a preta, with the same dependent origination, which is arising outside, they might not perceive it the same way as we at all. A god might perceive that same dependent arising in a different way. There's no inherent appearance of phenomena. So the Buddha coming here wouldn't necessarily see, you might say, oh, the Buddha would perceive this as a celestial mansion. Excuse me. Buddha would not necessarily, this assembly of parts here only appears that way due to our collective karma. To others, pretas, it might seem, or bardo beings, it seem totally non-obstructing. They go right through it. It's not perceived as a structure at all. To the Buddhas, there's no inherent appearance to their mind of the dependent arising which is due to our impure karma, our contaminated karma. But we, due to our collective karma, have a general appearance that most people will agree with. The sun seems to be circular. It's not elliptical. I have astigmatism, so maybe sometimes it looks elliptical. But we generally, within a realm, we have a certain collective karma that sees things generally the same way. But within that, there are variations according to our individual karma. But there's nothing inherently existing, from the Prasangika point of view, any of this conventionally existent dependent arising, none of it has any inherent nature of appearance or value. Yeah, of course.
So I can grok the concept that that there's a cup on the table, and because I live in the desire realm, along with Mark, we both see this cup in a certain way.
You guys live in the desire realm?
I believe so.
That's over in Silicon Valley, isn't it?
But the Krita being, between us here that we can't perceive, in the same place is examining that same phenomenon and perceiving something horrible or, in some other way.
Yeah.
But that seems to indicate to me that there's a basis there which our karma is labeling one way and that being's karma is labeling another way.
There is a dependent arising. Some people
doesn't see anything there.
Buddha doesn't see anything there, because the Buddha is not susceptible, not under the influence of contaminated karma. Okay, so the Buddha knows what we see there. It's not as though the Buddha, if you say this cup and the Buddha says, what cup? It's not like that. The Buddha knows all phenomena. Some phenomena the Buddha knows via knowing our minds, how it appears to contaminate. He knows how it appears to a preta, how it appears to a god, how it appears to a hell being, if a hell being can perceive it. Usually, those things that we perceive can be perceived by pretas to a certain extent, animals, humans, and some of the devas, depending on their clairvoyance. Usually, the hell beings wouldn't necessarily perceive what is here. Okay, so according to the dependent according to the individual karma of the individual. So the Buddha, it doesn't appear in any particular way. To a 10th level bodhisattva, still appears to be inherently existent. Appears that way. Appears to be truly existent. Even a 10th level Buddha. Pardon?
But to some non-Buddhas, there are some collection of non-Buddhas that would see an object there and some that would see no object there. So it's not the object by itself.
Well, yeah, because like say a hell being wouldn't see an object there. It depends on their karma. Yeah. The dependent arising itself has no necessary appearance or no necessary sense, like you're saying. One of them, like there is a real object there that someone sees one way and someone sees another way. Sometimes it's not as though there's really something there. That dependent arising, the dependent arising, functions for individuals with karma and delusion. That is to say, they perceive that continuity of dependent arising, which has arisen because of their collective karma. The Buddha is outside of that. Now, arhats, they are not under the influence of karma and delusion to a certain extent. They're no longer impelled within cyclic existence, but they still have the subtle imprints, subtle imprints that prevent omniscience, the obstructions to omniscience. So phenomena still appear, this dependent arising still appear to them according to whatever realm they happen to bring their mind to, and it appears as though it actually was inherently existent. To a Buddha's mind, nothing appears to be inherently existent. Buddha knows from its own side. Buddha knows how it appears to us. It knows how it appears to us to be truly existent, but one doesn't say that therefore it's appearing to be truly existent to the Buddha's mind. Okay? So, Oma wants to think about this for a minute.
No. Just then a Buddha. I mean, I'm trying to see the existence of a Buddha in the universe. They really wouldn't have a place of existence. They really wouldn't have a form. They really wouldn't have any of this stuff that we have. Then
Buddha doesn't need a wallet. Doesn't have to think, where's my wristwatch before I go out? Where's my driver's license?
they wouldn't need to have a body. They wouldn't need to have a mind.
That's right. From their own side, they don't. All right. So the Buddha's mind, from a Madhyamika point of view, say from something perhaps common to the tantric path also, the Buddha's being is made up of consciousness and wind, consciousness and prana, right?
I don't know.
Well, you know from general presentation of Tantra. So when we attain enlightenment, it's the subtle wind, the purified wind, that acts as the substantial cause of the Buddha's body. And it's a subtle mind that acts as the substantial cause of the omniscient mind, the Buddha's realization. So the subtle wind and subtle mind are inseparable. Because the Buddha's mind is omniscient and pervades all phenomena, that means the Buddha's body is everywhere. So the Buddha's body is not like in New York in Richard Gere's apartment or something like that and has to travel somewhere else. Even in the time of the Buddha, the Nirmanakaya is just an emanation body for the welfare of sentient beings. So when the Buddha's body manifests as the Nirmanakaya or Sambhogakaya, it's not for his or her own welfare. It's for the welfare of sentient beings.
I realize that, but what I'm trying to talk about is the Buddha in the universe. I mean, you're talking about the Buddha. Now, does the Buddha only appear like in this earth realm? Or like, would Buddha be on other planets? Or would the Buddha be in other universes?
I think we
or
could
would
write,
the Buddha
this would
be
be good. Oh, we could write a book. Buddha on Mars. I think so, yeah. Buddha can appear anywhere, sure. Buddha. It depends if sentient beings are there. If there are spirits on these places, and the Buddha may appear in various ways. The Buddha's...
to appear to sentient beings.
Buddha, yeah, there's no one else to appear to. Doesn't appear to rocks. There's no other beings other than sentient beings. I mean, you could say living things like plants, but as they have no mind, there's no sense of the Buddha appearing to them and saying, "Oh, you wonderful plants, follow me." There's no sense.
Have to be made out of carbon.
Who doesn't?
Buddhas. No, Buddhism.
No, beings, the sentient beings. Sentient beings made out of carbon?
Just
Have a carbon
formless?
base?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Necessarily.
No, I'm just trying to see it as, I don't know.
So let's, okay, we're going to have to take a break in a minute. So we won't do a meditation right now. We'll do it at the beginning of the next session. But let's just go over this a little bit. So when we talk about tenets, to be able to understand the subtle view of emptiness, you kind of see that all of the various philosophical schools acted as a kind of graduated, step-by-step, like the staircase that lead one closer to that realization. If you're familiar from previous lifetimes, you might be able to get the Prasangika view very quickly. Otherwise, even if you are familiar, the great lamas, the great saints always took the aspect of studying, like Atisha, studying all of the various philosophical schools as an emulation to others, for others to follow, because that's something that others have to do, and also to reaffirm those realizations that they made in previous lives so that they can understand better that subtle view. So what we're studying, these lower schools, is not, you might say, well, all that stuff is wrong. It's only the Prasangika school view that's right. But that's not the point. The whole point of Buddha's teachings was as a teaching device, sort of pedagogical device to be able to lead living beings, sentient beings, to the correct realization. So let's take a break. Come back.
One might even have
Pardon?
the subtle selflessness, that view.
An animal probably wouldn't have a view of selflessness.
No, I don't mean the intellectual.
No, selfless. You're talking about selflessness. It would have a grasping to the self. Yeah, yeah. It wouldn't have a view that's a wisdom consciousness that realizes selflessness, but it would have a innate grasping to the self. Okay. Maybe some animals have some intellectually formed. Are we up and running? Some animals may have intellectually formed delusions. What do you think? When you say Fido, Fido's my dog. A big smile on his face or her face, and yeah, maybe there's some intellectually sense of who they are. I am the better.
With the can opener and the cat comes running, but it's really, a can of chili or something like that. That's an intellectually formed delusion.
That's my food.
Right.
Perhaps, yeah. So one has to check. I'm not sure. Generally, we would say intellectually formed delusions arise from, the experiences of this lifetime, from thinking. So most people don't think that animals think, but animals, I believe, do think from a Buddhist perspective. They don't have the same wisdom that distinguishes them from us. So let's sit and meditate, and in the terms, Sister Oma will be patient with us because I will have to say some words here.
Oh, good grief. No, I meant that you said that.
Okay? You're glad I said that? Okay. So we won't call, from Oma's point of view, it's not meditation. This kind of meditation is what we call led meditation, and in a sense, it's what you might think of how, in a more skillful fashion, you yourself might be leading your own mind in meditation. Okay? It's kind of like thinking. It's not like you should feel incapacitated to do meditation unless someone's leading you. You have to be able to do the meditation, but because we're still beginning, someone sometimes maybe gives us an example how they might meditate. So let's calm our mind first of all. To be able to calm the mind, you have to be able to take the mind away from the various appearances that arise internally to your mind, the thought patterns, some of which might seem urgent, and therefore it's very difficult to calm the mind. That's why the life of simplicity and ethical behavior are very important, because then there are less things that seem paramount, urgent. Bring your attention to the spaciousness of your mind. And whatever appears to the consciousness, again and again, let go of it, always abiding in a spaciousness, clear light nature. Now, sequentially, let's try to investigate how the self appears from a very gross perspective. Intellectually, we might say, if I ask you, who are you? We might say, well, I'm George the monk. I'm a man. I grew up, or I'm a boy in my case. I had these life experiences. I am a this, or I'm a that. I am a Caucasian, or I am a Buddhist, or different kinds of intellectually labeled and formed ideas of who I am. I've had these life experiences, therefore I'm better or worse. I'm a loser, or I'm smart, I'm clever, I'm whatever. These kinds of concepts of ourself are intellectually formed. But there's more pernicious sense of ourself, intellectually formed, the sense that there is a self that's appearing to the mind, which is eternal and independent of the body and mind. The various tenets have different ways of countering that. This is, say, what the lower schools would say, the gross selflessness of persons, which has, I'm not sure if the lower schools would say there's an innate form of this, but certainly the upper schools of Prasangika said there's no innate form of this. This is not even the gross selflessness of persons. Even the gross selflessness of persons should have an innate form. But we can understand this sense of the self as being permanent, partless, and independent of the aggregates. We know that the I, the self, depends upon the aggregates. Because when the aggregates experience some problem, if they're cut, if they're beaten, if they're burned, we say, I have been beaten, cut, or burned. Or I am sick. I am happy. Also, the I is not permanent, although intellectually we might think that it's something unchanging, because it does, like everything that depends on causes and conditions, it's evolving moment by moment, it's momentary. the I would not be able to experience any different phenomena, different kinds of changes, unless it was itself impermanent. It couldn't go from life to life. It couldn't die. It couldn't experience pleasure and so forth unless it was impermanent. Now let's go deeper. There's a sense of I that's recognized in the lower schools as a subtle self of persons. Because here we're talking about that which appears to the mind, a sense of a self, not selflessness, but just a sense of a self that we'll realize later is empty of that. This sense of a self that can have an innate version, can appear from life to life, is a sense of a self-supporting, or let's say a substantially existent self, not an imputedly existent self. One that has a substance not necessarily independent of the aggregates as the intellectually formed, permanent, partless, independent self, but not identical to the aggregates either. Not one of the aggregates, not the body, not the mind, not the feelings, not identifying with them, but as though something that participates in that, the experience of the aggregates, the experiencer, the taster. If we think of our aggregates as being members of a committee or salespeople, the sense of this self-supporting, substantially existent person is not a different entity from the committee, but not one of the committee members. It's like the chairman of the committee or the head salesman. In our modern speak, maybe the chairman of the board, our personal Donald Trump. Let's see if we can, watching the mind, see if you can get a sense of that appearance of the I, this object to be negated. For instance, when you desire to have a cup of tea or a cookie, or want to see a movie, or want to read a book or have some enjoyment, see a movie. Who is it? Why is it that we want to do those things, to experience some pleasure? Because it's a sense of I. Well, I want to. I feel I need a break. I. What I is that? Of course, there will be subtler versions functioning, but on one level we may notice this grosser sense of a controller of the body and mind, the experiencer, which is not really different than the aggregates and not really the same as them, but substantially existent, having a real existence, not just being imputed. See if, in thinking about something pleasurable or some kind of aim like that, why should I be doing this? Why should I take a walk? Why should I read? Why do I want to do something? I want that. It's not just that the body likes chocolate or that the tongue consciousness experiences pleasure. It's that there is a sense of I, which is a participant in that group of aggregates, but not the aggregate, not identifying with his tongue consciousness, but still substantially existent, still sort of existing on an equal footing with the aggregates. Again, even in the lower schools, we can counter this misconception, this appearance and this misconception, grasping to it as true, by understanding the person is imputedly existent, not substantially existent. It depends upon the five aggregates and is not a substance that is on an equal footing with the five aggregates. It depends completely upon them in a different way. There is, let's say, when you have a taste on your tongue, there is a pleasant taste. Let's say, I was assuming it's a pleasant taste. A pleasant taste on the tongue, but there is no other experiencer other than the tongue consciousness, perhaps relished by the mental consciousness. But of the five aggregates, the consciousness aggregate or feeling aggregate, there are no other self that's experiencing that, some substantially existent self. I'm not talking about phenomena, but just the self. Even in the Chittamatra school, we have the same sense of self, self-supporting, substantially existent self. Even in the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, this is the self that has to be overcome. This is the grasping to this has to be eliminated, ceased through developing the wisdom that sees the lack of that, the emptiness of that self-supporting, substantially existent self. Now, even if one understood that such a substantially existent self was not present, because that itself does not negate the true existence of the aggregates, the other five aggregates. It's not talking about their non-inherent existence. There's still a subtle sense of the self even beyond that as being truly existent or inherently existent. Even if one were to temporarily remove that through meditation, cause it to be unmanifest, there's still a sense of I or self when referring to the conventionally existent self, which is imputed on the five aggregates, but then letting go of those five aggregates, there still is the appearance of a self to the consciousness that is, though existing from its own side, irregardless of relationship with the aggregates. A self that is true, truly existent, in the sense that it is not merely a name. It's as though it really has a findable existence from its own side, or an inherent existence. To be able to see that object of negation, sometimes we have learned to think of something irritating, having been falsely accused or gotten in an argument, and see how the I arises. But once you're familiar, one doesn't have to instigate it that way. Just this subtle sense of the I, through passing through permanent, partless, independent sense of a self, a self-supporting, substantially existent self, to something more subtle, a self that seems to be existing from its own side, not merely imputed. And we compare that with the merely imputed I. Merely imputed here means there is nothing that can be found when analyzed within the basis of designation, which is that I. Just that collection of parts is merely called the self. And that self, ephemeral, like a rainbow, like an illusion, like a dream experience, it functions but does not exist the way that it appears to our mind. Although the conventionally existent self, merely imputed self, does not necessarily, that is not necessarily truly existent. Can't be true. Nothing is truly existent, but doesn't necessarily imply it is truly existent. Yet as soon as we think of ourself, I am George, I am Mark, I am Frank, I am Diana. As soon as we think of ourself conventionally imputed, there appears, because of habituation over numberless lifetimes, a sense of a self which is true, truly existent, findable, inherently existent. It's this object that appears to our consciousness, not just doctrine of the Buddha said this and that, this is something that actually we can experience. This appearance and the grasping to it are our problem. Among the two, the main problem is the grasping to it, the assent to that, the lack of wisdom, the ignorance that accepts that, grasps to it as true, and therefore gives rise to our anger, our depression, our attachment, our pride, our jealousy, all our problems, our fear, our loneliness. Who is there to be lonely? Who is there to be attached? Who is there to be angry? To refute this truly existent sense of the I, the appearance, even though the main problem is the grasping, what we have to do to overcome the grasping is develop a wisdom that is its antidote, that sees this appearance as not truly existent, sees this appearance as not having any truth to it, as a falsity. And as we said before, the first step in doing that is to recognize this object of negation. So abide with it for some time. See if you can just settle, see if you can see the sense, the presence of that sense of I. Let's say the meditator. Who's meditating right now? Who's striving to learn, to have a good life, to have less problems? Who is that? Who is it that feels an ache in the legs or in the back? Who is it that feels hot? It's not just the body. When you go in, at first there may be the sense of the self-supporting, substantially existent person, but going beyond that, more subtle sense of the self. Even although initially dependent upon observing the aggregates, it appears even when the aggregates are not appearing. And is believed by our mind, is grasped to, at least assented, accepted as really there. What if this I didn't really exist? What if the sense of its reality is due to our assent to it, our belief in it? So having identified, in a certain extent, the object of negation, then to establish the pervasion, second of the four essential points. If such a truly existent I were to exist, it would have to be truly one with the aggregates, inherently one with the aggregates, or inherently different than the aggregates. How could we make that statement? If anything exists, if any two things exist, they either have to be the same or different. There's no other third, fourth, fifth choice. Dog and dog are the same. Dog and perro are the same in substance but different in name. What about the sense of the person, the self, and the aggregates? If the person were to truly exist, the self were to truly exist, it would either have to be the same as the aggregates, identical to them, truly one, not just conventionally one, identical, but truly one in every way. Or it would have to be truly different than the aggregates. Well, according to your own life experiences and study, there are many different reasons to refute those two possibilities. Those are the next two essential points. It is not inherently one. The self is not inherently one with the aggregates. For instance, if it were inherently one with the aggregates, there would have to be one aggregate. Or there would have to be 5 selves, as there are 5 aggregates. We sense one self. This is the object that we're trying to understand, the appearance of the self. So there are not 5 selves. That's absurd. And even if it were, let's say, the mental consciousness as the mental consciousness is comprised of parts, virtuous, non-virtuous, neutral, temporal parts also, past, present, future, many numberless instances. There would have to be numberless instances of the I if the I was truly existent, truly existently one with the aggregate of consciousness, even if it was one of the aggregates. So we can discard that. The I is not inherently one with the aggregates, nor is it inherently different than the aggregates, because if it were inherently or truly different than the aggregates, it would have no relationship with them whatsoever. Being truly existent, it would be existing from its own side, findable, different than the aggregates. So whatever change experienced by the aggregates would not be experienced by the self. But we know whatever the aggregates experience, pleasure, pain, indifference, any kind of change, aging, death, transference of consciousness, birth in different realms, the I necessarily experiences those. So go back to identifying, recognizing the I, the innate appearance of the I and the ignorance grasping to it. Recall the pervasion. If it existed this way, it would have to be inherently one with the aggregates or inherently different than the aggregates. It can't be one with the aggregates. It can't be inherently one with the aggregates. If it were, there'd have to be either 5 selves or one aggregate. Even if we considered the possibility of one aggregate, such as the consciousness aggregate that has parts, so the self is not one with the aggregates. And it's not inherently different than the aggregates. It would have to be utterly unrelated to them, if so. If it existed, it would have to be one of those two, but it's neither of those two. Therefore, this I that's appearing has appeared in various guises since beginningless time. The innate sense of the I and the grasping to it, that I does not exist at all the way that it appears. It's like an illusion, like a magician's magical creation, like a mirage, reflection in the mirror. If that insight dawns due to that inferential cognizer is a conscious phenomena having been developed from a correct sign, correct reason. If that wisdom dawns, it merely sees that that self that was previously cognized as real is not true, is not truly existent. Perceives a mere negation, like an empty space. Certainty that that I does not exist whatsoever the way that it appears is true. If it begins to fade from your mind, as in the practice of the combination of tranquil abiding and penetrative insight, one again has to engage in analysis. This I that's appearing, if it existed the way that it appears, it would have to be either one with the aggregates or different. It's not one with the aggregates for this reason. It's not different than the aggregates for this reason. Therefore, it doesn't exist. And again, settle on space-like equipoise on emptiness of the self. Having some feeling of that, you can apply it to phenomena other than the self, such as one